A couple of years ago, I designed a spiral Christmas tree that people went absolutely nuts over. I've received tons and tons of emails and comments from people that just could not keep up with orders for these things. So just like I teach, anytime that you make something that's a big hit, put a little twist to it and put out the latest and greatest version. And that's just what I did with this new 4-sided spiral tree. So let me teach you how to build it. So for this new version of the tree, you can pretty much use any 2-inch material that you would like. You could use a single 10-foot 2x4, or you could use a single 8-foot 2x6. The price is pretty much the same, and this 2x6 was only $4.38 in my area. Oh, zombie fly. I hit that thing square and it flew right back off. Somebody put that one in the pet cemetery. So if you built any of the previous versions of the tree, this one's going to be a little bit different. So for this new design, we're going to start by cutting our board into 21-inch pieces. All right, so now that we have our board cut down into 4 21-inch pieces, and I actually have a little piece of scrap left. I'm going to hang on to that because I'm going to be using that for the base later. But let's go ahead and head over to the table saw and cut these rounded edges off. So to remove these rounded edges, I'm just going to remove 1/8 of an inch from each side. Since a typical 2x6 is 5.5 inches wide, this is going to leave me with 4 5.25 inch boards. And as always, I'm going to be teaching you step by step, but if you're a plans in the hand type of person, head over to my website, where I'll throw a link in the description. So now with our boards trimmed up, before we actually start cutting these into strips, I'm going to go ahead and cut some notches in this material. This is going to be a lot easier to do with the boards whole versus trying to do this into smaller pieces. You'll see what I'm talking about. Since we'll eventually be ripping this down into 1/2-inch strips, I want 1/2-inch notches. So essentially I want the center points of these notches to be at 7 and 14 inches. Since they're going to be 1/2 of an inch wide, I'm going to make a mark at 6 3/4 and 7 1/4. Then I'll just slide down and mark 13 3/4 and 14 1/4. In between those two marks will be the 1/2 of an inch of material that I know that I need to remove. And then I'm going to do this for all 4 boards. Once we have all of our notches marked on one side, we're going to flip the material over and then repeat this for the backs. You'll see where this comes into play here in a minute. Another option for laying these out would just be to line up our boards, make our marks on one board, then transfer that line to the others. So now that we have our material marked to where we want our notches, it's time to cut the notches. And you can do this several different ways. I'm going to be using the miter saw with a depth stop, but this could easily be done on the table saw with a miter gauge using a single blade or a dado stack. Another super easy way to cut these without using the table saw or the miter saw would just be to use a circular saw. The only thing that you would have to do is to set the depth for 5/16 like I'm about to do on the miter saw. The first thing that I'm going to do is just put a piece of scrap material on my miter saw table. This will allow the blade to pass all the way through the material without leaving an arch on either side. Now I need to set the depth of my cut. And to do this, I'm just going to mark 5/16 of an inch on the side of one of my boards, and then use that as a reference for setting up my depth stop. Now if you're doing this on a table saw with a miter gauge, you just raise your blade up to 5/16 of an inch. If you're using a depth stop, you would just flip that down, and then adjust it so that the longest tooth on your blade is right at your mark. So now with that set up and your depth stop locked into position, let's use a little scrap piece of material to test our depth. Now with our depth set to where we want it, let's go ahead and cut our notches on both sides of each board. The one thing that we want to make sure of is that our notches are 1/2 of an inch wide. It's not going to hurt anything if they're just a little wider. If they're too narrow, then our parts will not lock together. If you have a piece of scrap wood laying around that's 1/2 of an inch wide, my advice would be to cut a 1/2 of an inch off of a piece of scrap wood, or if you have a 1/2 of an inch strip of anything laying around, just use that as a reference. All right, so now that we have all of our notches cut, now for the fun part. Set over to the table saw and cut some strips. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. You can set your table saw fence up for 1/2 of an inch and make sure that you have a long enough push stick to push the material through the saw. And as long as you're using a riving knife and you maintain control of the board, you really shouldn't have any issues with this. Or you could do what I'm going to do for the rest of these strips and use a thin rip jig. I talked about these in one of my latest tool videos, and they are super handy. I'm going to set my jig up to cut 1/2 of an inch strips and cut all of my parts this way. All right, so now I have my parts cut down into 1/2-inch strips, and they look something like this. And regardless of what material that you chose to use, be it 2x4s, 2x6s, whatever, as long as it was 2-inch material or 1.5 inch, your parts should look the same. Now, since I used 2x6 material, I actually had a few leftover parts, which is fine because you never know when something may break because of a knot or however. But ultimately, the goal is to have 25 pieces that look just like that. And then once you have your 25 pieces, we're going to reset this saw and run them all back through one more time. So the first thing that I'm going to do is lower my blade and set it to cut a 1/2 inch material. And then with that set, I'm going to set my fence so that it will split this board directly down the center. Depending on whether you're using a thin kerf blade or a standard blade, the exact settings may vary, so the best way to set this up is just to mark 3/4 inch in and then place that mark in the center of a tooth. Now with your fence set, we'll just run these boards through. What I like to do with thinner boards like this is just to make a wider push stick that can ride the fence with the material. This not only pushes both of your parts through the blade and out of the way, but it also keeps your fingertips far away from the blade. Right, so now that we have our 25 boards cut in half, we can start laying these out to make our cuts. I'll just lay all of my parts out with the grooves facing up. Then I'm just going to take a straight edge and square up all of my parts. So now with all of my grooves lined up, I'm going to make a mark in the bottom center of the right hand groove and a mark in the very center of the left hand groove on the top. I'm just going to take a straight edge and line that up with the bottom left hand corner and my center mark at the top. Just going to trace this out. And then while I have my straight edge here, on the left side of my straight edge, I'm just going to put an X on this material. We won't be needing this. I'm going to move the bottom of my straight edge over to the bottom mark in the center of my right hand groove. And I'll trace this out, and then keeping my center at the bottom, I'm going to move my straight edge over so that it connects to the top right hand corner. And then I'll trace this out. Then I'm going to do the same thing on this right hand side that I did with the left. I'm just going to X out everything that's on the right side of my straight edge. And this is what it'll look like when you have all of your parts marked out. Now you can actually start to visualize what I have going on here. As you can see on the left hand side, in the very center of this notch is a tree. Then on the right hand side, in the center of that mark is an upside down tree. So by laying it out this way, once we make these cuts, every limb of this tree will have an exact duplicate size that will match. Let's go ahead and get these cut and put together. So now to make my cuts, I'm just going to be using the miter saw and cutting 7 or 8 boards at a time. Now at the miter saw, we'll take our angled lines and figure out what angle that we need to cut. For these angles, that is going to be 14 degrees. If you decided to make your tree taller or shorter, you would just angle the miter saw until it matches the lines on your boards. Now whenever I make this cut, there's going to be some small parts. So to keep any of those parts from getting sucked into the saw, I'm just going to put a sacrificial board against my fence. Essentially, this is just a piece of scrap wood. And for some reason, if you get to the saw and your parts have shifted, just put a piece of 1/2 inch material in one of your notches and it'll line everything right back up. Now I'll just line my blade up and cut in the very center of each one of my lines. Make sure to toss the scrap material as I go and then keep all of my parts in order. After I make my first cut, I'll get rid of the scraps, and then reposition my saw to 14 degrees to the right, then make that cut. And then once that cut's done, I'll move it back to 14 degrees to the left, then make my final cut. There's going to be a few pieces of the very tips that's pretty much just going to be turning to dust. And that is perfectly fine because we're not going to be able to use those small pieces anyway. So now with the very bottom of one side cut and the very tip top of the other, I'm going to make sure to keep these separated on my work table and keep working my way up. Now that we have our waste removed, and now the only parts that we have left are our tree parts, we can start matching up all of these. But before I move any of this, just in case I drop some or however, probably should have done this actually before I cut the angles. I'm going to make a mark in the grooves on one side of the tree. Then if I ever have any issues, I'll always know that the one with the black mark goes together. So before we start matching these, I'm just going to put a bead of wood glue down the center of each one of these grooves. Now that's all that we need to do is just simply match up the boards for each level. And again, we'll keep these in order. Then we'll just make sure as we're putting these together, all of our angles on the edges are going the same direction. So since the tips of these trees were too small to use, we are now left with 47 levels. Now that we have all of our parts matched up, we're ready to start drilling holes. But before we do that, let's go ahead and make our base. That way whenever we drill the holes in these, we can just slide them right into place. So to make our base, I'll use the leftover end piece that we had from the very beginning. This should be right around 11.5 inches long. If it's not, I'll trim it down to that size. Then I'm just going to clean up each edge just like we did for the other boards, and then cut this into two 2.5 inch boards. Then once I have the two pieces ripped to size, I'm going to put a 45-degree angle on the ends of each board. So now that we have our 45s on our two stand parts, we're going to half lap these. So to mark this out, I need one of my boards face up and one of my boards face down. On the board that is face up, I'm going to make a mark at 2.5 inches and 4 inches. And in between these two marks will be the material that I'm going to be removing. And then on the board that is face down, I'm going to make a mark that is 5 inches from the edge and 6.5. Now we'll set up our depth stop on the miter saw like we did for the other parts at 1 1/4 of an inch. Or if you use the table saw with a miter gauge, you'll just raise your blade to 1 1/4 of an inch. In hindsight, I probably should have done this before I cut my 45-degree angles. But you know what they say about hindsight, so I had to cut down a piece of scrap wood to 2.5 inches so that it would be the same thickness as my base. Made a mark at 1 1/4 inch and I'll set my depth. With my sacrificial board in place, I'll go ahead and cut my 2 notches. The only bad thing about using a sacrificial board is it's essentially doing what it's supposed to do, and it's narrowing the throat of the saw, which is also narrowing where the sawdust needs to go. So it may be a little bit messier. Now we'll just lock these two parts together with some wood glue. Then I'm going to drill a 3/8 of an inch hole in the very center. I have my bit marked with a piece of tape so my hole will be 2 inches deep. This is going to be holding the dowel that's going to be supporting the tree, so we want it to be straight. So in order to do that, I'll start this hole using Craig's drill guide. Now I'm going to add a little wood glue to my hole, and then I'm going to install an oak 3/8 of an inch by 36 inch dowel rod. With the base made, let's drill some holes in these limbs and get this tree put together. So another option that you can use instead of dowel rod if you really wanted to stiffen this up, just some 3/8 inch thread stock. You would still only need a 36 inch piece, and this stuff's pretty cheap. So since I built the last version using dowel rod, for the new version, I'm going to use some of this thread stock. Again, what you do with yours, that's up to you. So for drilling the holes in the limbs, I'm going to start with the largest and work my way up to the smallest. And to do this, you can either use a drill with a 3/8 of an inch bit, or if you have a drill press, it may be easier to do it with that. Regardless of which you decide to use, just make sure that the hole that you drill will fit the dowel rod. Oftentimes dowels may say that they're 3/8 of an inch, but they may end up being a bit thicker from wood expansion. And once you have all of your holes drilled, we'll just slide all of our parts over the dowel rod, or in my case, this thread stock. Right, so the only thing left to do, and this is completely optional, is we can add a star. We have enough of our dowel or thread stock sticking up for a star, so let's go ahead and add one. If you're not going to be adding a star, take about 1.5 inches of material off the top of your dowel. Okay, so to make this star, I'm just using a piece of scrap wood here. The end of it's actually split and I have it X'd out. Then I actually still have the template that I used for the previous design. So you can either freehand your star out, or in the previous design video I actually teach you how to draw a perfect star, or if you've decided to purchase the plans for this build, I'll make sure to throw in a star template. So I'm just going to trace this 3-inch star out onto my piece of scrap wood and then cut this out with a jigsaw. I'll do a little bit of sanding and shaping afterwards, and then I'll drill a 3/8 inch hole in the bottom. And to determine the depth of the hole, just measure how much of the dowel that you have left sticking out. And just like that, we have put a new twist, pun totally intended, to something that was an awesome build to begin with. Now, it's super awesome. So for less than $5 in wood, we have created something super unique. This just goes to show you that you do not have to spend a ton of money to make something awesome. The only thing that you really need is just a bit of creativity. And if you haven't had a chance to check out my new course, Woodworking Kickstart from Novice to Natural, just head over to my website to find out what this is all about. And I can guarantee that this is the most detailed and comprehensive woodworking course on the market. And I hope to see you on the inside.